can see him. Step back from the counter.
Sir, I already paid. Here's the receipt.
I don't care. Step outside, now.
I'm following the rules. I'm not causing trouble.
Don't argue with me. Move it.
This is wrong. You're ignoring the proof. Look at the receipt.
It was a Tuesday morning in suburban Kansas City. The fluorescent lights of a quiet convenience store flickered over the linoleum floor, reflecting a tension no customer could ignore. Outside, a car idled, too long, too patient. Inside, a black master sergeant, uniform crisp, wallet in hand, presented a receipt. Moments later, handcuffs clicked. The world narrowed to a single impossible question: how does a law enforcement officer, sworn to uphold justice, decide to destroy the life of a man serving his country? Silence filled the store. The cameras captured everything, got witness a story of courage, prejudice, and institutional failure. Follow the journey from arrest to reckoning, where accountability, law, and morality collide. Every detail matters. Every choice leaves a scar. Watch, reflect, and decide whose side is justice really on. The automatic door slid open with a low hiss, releasing a gust of cold air into the convenience store. The fluorescent lights above flickered once, then steadied, casting the linoleum floor in harsh white squares. Outside, a patrol car idled on the edge of the lot. Unremarkable, but its presence was a quiet, almost imperceptible signal of tension. Inside, Master Sergeant Anthony Hayes moved with the measured precision of someone trained to observe every detail. A life honed by decades of military discipline. He wore his uniform neatly pressed, his boots polished, the rank insignia catching the store lights. In his right hand, a receipt for a small purchase. In his left, the invisible weight of expectations no one had asked him to carry. The cashier glanced up, briefly breaking his concentration before returning to scanning items. The store smelled faintly of coffee and disinfectant, a mundane aroma, yet Hayes felt the subtle shift in the air. The way the few customers glanced nervously, how a clerk's hand hesitated over the cash drawer. There was no reason for alarm. There never was. And yet, by the time Officer Daniel Mercer entered from the side door, the room's atmosphere had already thickened. Mercer's boots scuffed the tile with a controlled rhythm, deliberate, as if each step announced his authority. He had been on the force for 8 years. Trained in the department's bias awareness protocols, the mandatory annual in-service that stressed impartiality, de-escalation, and procedural compliance. On paper, he knew better. In practice, he let the uniform define him more than the law ever could. ID and receipt, please, Mercer said. Voice flat, clipped, like a command issued across a drill field. Hayes complied immediately, producing the small slip of paper that confirmed his purchase. The transaction was complete, every box checked. But Mercer's gaze lingered, a slow burn that refused logic. "Where'd you get this?" Mercer asked, tone neutral but eyes sharp, scanning for contradiction where none existed. "From the register, sir," Hayes replied calmly, meeting the officer's stare without flinching. His voice carried the calm authority of someone used to command, yet underlined by a silent warning: do not mistake civility for weakness. The seconds stretched. Silence wrapped the small store, punctuated only by the soft hum of refrigeration units. Mercer's hand hovered near his duty belt, fingers brushing the cold metal of his holstered firearm. It was a subtle assertion of power, yet it transformed the moment into a question far larger than either man could answer. How much does color, assumption, and unchecked authority weigh against fact? "Step outside," Mercer said finally, voice firmer now, carrying the unspoken threat of escalation. Hayes hesitated a microsecond only, and then followed, the receipt still clutched between his fingers, as if holding evidence could anchor reality. Outside, the winter wind cut through the space between them. Hayes' boots hit the asphalt in steady, deliberate cadence. Mercer's hand rested on his belt, thumb brushing the cold steel up. Handcuffs. There was a trained rhythm here, one Hayes recognized from countless military drills: approach, assess, control. Only this was not a training exercise. The first click of the cuffs felt louder than anything else a sound meant to enforce compliance, but also a sound that shattered certainty. "Do you know why I'm arresting you?" Mercer asked. There was no preamble, no explanation, only the expectation of obedience. Hayes shook his head slightly, eyes calm, voice steady. "I followed protocol, sir. Here's the receipt." Mercer ignored the paper. He never looked at it. Every professional instinct Hayes had relied on in combat in life, in law enforcement collaborations seemed irrelevant. The handcuffs tightened, metal biting into his wrists. A tactile affirmation that bureaucracy and prejudice had eclipsed evidence. The camera from the patrol car captured every angle, the streetlights glinting off steel, the wind lifting paper from the lot. Hayes' calm but alert posture, Mercer's rigid assertion of control. It was evidence of reality, and yet it already felt like a distortion. The world had narrowed to this. One man restrained, one man empowered, a receipt that mattered only in theory. In that moment, the arrest was complete. The master sergeant, who had served 20 years defending his country, mentoring young soldiers, and navigate life and death decisions overseas, was now at the mercy of a system that had forgotten how to see him clearly. Hayes' silence said more than any protest could. Mercer's rigidity said more than any law manual could justify. And somewhere between the click of the handcuffs and the approaching squad car, story of accountability, of right, wrong, and moral failure began to write itself. Absolutely. Let's continue with Chapter 2, the first 500 to 600 words, cinematic, emotionally resonant, and procedurally anchored. The fluorescent buzz of the precinct was different than the store's harsh lights. Here, it was muted, mechanical, a backdrop to conversations that never touched the truth. Officer Mercer had filed his report, typed carefully in the department's digital system, a series of neutral verbs and passive constructions that masked every bias, every decision left unexamined. His sergeant glanced over the screen, nodded once, and moved on. No questions asked. No accountability demanded. Master Sergeant Anthony Hayes sat in a holding cell, the metal bench beneath him cold, the air stale with the scent of cleaning chemicals and sweat. The handcuffs still pressed lightly into his wrists, a persistent reminder that procedure could be weaponized. He replayed the incident in his mind, not out of disbelief, but to map the mechanics of failure. He had done everything by the book: identification, proof of purchase, measured compliance. And yet, here he was, a symbol of how authority could bend, unchallenged when prejudice whispered just beneath the surface. Outside the cell, the precinct moved with habitual efficiency. Officers spoke in clipped sentences, their own discomfort buried behind jargon, custody procedures, booking protocols, chain of command. No one mentioned race. No one mentioned the receipt. The silence was institutional, a tacit agreement that some actions, once done, were beyond scrutiny. Hayes' own attorney later would call it structural indifference, a system designed to protect the institution first, the individual second. Calls came from the unit. Colleagues he had served alongside in deployments reached out, cautiously. At first, their voices low over phone lines, checking his well-being. Their words were careful, laden with the understanding that bureaucracy could not only fail but punish. "We know the truth," one said. "We'll stand by you." Hayes appreciated it, but the reassurance felt almost abstract. Support existed, but it could not undo the public humiliation. The arrest captured on store cameras now circulating online. The administrator lieutenant reviewed the body cam footage, pausing on every frame that highlighted Hayes' calm composure and Mercer's rigid posturing. The footage was a procedural necessity, intended for internal review, yet it revealed the stark truth. Evidence did not guarantee justice. Policies existed on paper, from departmental bias training to explicit instructions on verifying transactions. And yet, these safeguards failed in the hands of someone unwilling to engage with them. Meanwhile, whispers in the community began to take shape. Some sympathized with Hayes, posting online, sharing videos, and questioning how an officer could ignore a receipt, a fundamental piece of evidence. Others, less informed, repeated Mercer's account, unaware of the discrepancy. Public perception became a battlefield, one Hayes had no control over, no matter how measured his actions had been. The department convened a closed-door meeting. Internal affairs officers attended, notes in hand, questions rehearsed. Mercer described his version of events with the precision of a trained narrative, but the questions were perfunctory, the probing shallow. Hayes' attorney attempted to submit photographic evidence of the receipt during the initial review. It was filed into a folder and placed on a shelf, the symbol of proof reduced to bureaucracy. Back in his home, Hayes removed the handcuffs, but the restraint lingered in his mind. Sleep came fitfully. In the quiet of the night, the weight of institutional indifference pressed hardest. How many officers had been subjected to similar procedural disregard, dismissed because the system valued hierarchy over justice? How many would face the same quiet erosion of dignity without a camera, without a receipt, without public scrutiny? And yet, amid the silence, Hayes began to chart a path forward, not through anger or retaliation, but through meticulous documentation, through engagement with legal mechanisms that could not be ignored. The story of the arrest, once confined to a store aisle, now extended into courts, media, and public conscience. Institutional silence had a sound, and it was heavy, but it was not absolute. The moment had passed, yet its echoes would grow louder. The courtroom smelled of polished wood, old leather, the faint tang of ink lingering from case files stacked high on the prosecutor's desk. Fluorescent lights cast hard shadows on the walls, catching every crease. In the neatly pressed suits and the furrowed brows of the public gallery, outside, a small crowd had gathered, signs half made, voices muted but insistent. Cameras from local news stations angled to capture the tension, the looming question on everyone's mind. How could a decorated master sergeant be arrested over a receipt he had shown in plain view? Inside, Anthony Hayes sat with the calm precision of a soldier. His posture was deliberate, controlled, every muscle poised for observation, not confrontation. Across the aisle, Officer Daniel Mercer shifted, the crisp lines of his uniform tight against his frame, eyes darting to the gallery and back to his attorney. The man who had once wielded authority with unquestioned certainty now navigated scrutiny with a careful, defensive choreography. "State your case," the judge said, voice measured but carrying the weight of expectation. Procedural law dictated clarity, evidence, and intent. And now the scales of justice would weigh the reality of bias against the rigor of documented fact. Hayes' attorney stood first, laying out the timeline, the evidence, the receipt, body cam footage, witness statements from bystanders, and internal policies Mercer had violated. Every word was precise, but it carried an unspoken moral weight. This was not just a technical argument. It was a challenge to the department's ethical backbone. Mercer's defense was practiced, rehearsed. He spoke in measured sentences, emphasizing procedure, claiming concern over possible fraud, despite the receipt clearly documenting the transaction. The courtroom air tightened with each claim, a silent dialogue between truth and perception. Every pause, every glance, every exhalation conveyed the tension words could not capture. Hayes remained composed, letting the evidence speak for itself, while Mercer's discomfort grew under the quiet but relentless gaze of logic and public scrutiny. Outside the courtroom, social media erupted. Videos from the body cam, edited with the store surveillance, were shared millions of times. Headlines screamed outrage, Master Sergeant arrested over valid receipt, officers' bias exposed. Opinion pieces dissected departmental policies, questioned training procedure, and highlighted systemic failures in law enforcement accountability. Citizens debated not just the act itself, but the culture that enabled it. Hashtags trended regionally, hashtag justice for Hayes, hashtag bias in blue, hashtag accountability matters. Public awareness became a force as undeniable as any legal motion. Inside the courtroom, tension mounted as witnesses were called. Store employees testified to Hayes' calm demeanor, the precise manner in which the transaction occurred, and Mercer's insistence on escalating without justification. Colleagues from Hayes' unit spoke to his character, his decades of service, and the improbability that he could provoke the arrest in any way. Each statement layered the narrative with credibility, but also highlighted a chilling reality: the law alone was not enough. It had to contend with entrenched assumptions, institutional inertia, and public skepticism. Mercer's defense attorney attempted to pivot, citing departmental discretion and the subjective judgment officers must exercise in the field. It was a legal dance, the tension between individual decision-making and procedural compliance made tangible. Hayes' attorney countered methodically, referencing Kansas City Police Department training manuals, bias awareness protocols, and internal guidance on verifying purchase evidence. Each citation was more than law. It was a mirror held to the department's failure, a reflection of systemic neglect. And then came the human moments, brief, almost imperceptible, yet weighty. Hayes' eyes scanned the courtroom, catching the nod of his former unit. The anxious expressions of bystanders, the flicker of doubt in Mercer's gaze. Each pause, each breath, each glance amplified the moral stakes. This was more than money or policy. It was recognition that authority, when unchecked, could crush the lives of those it swore to protect. The news hit the precinct like a winter storm. Mercer had been fired. No fanfare, no public ceremony. Just a quiet administrative notice posted internally, the kind meant to keep appearances intact while the ripple of consequence spread outward. For Anthony Hayes, the sensation was strange, almost surreal. Victory, in the literal sense, had been achieved, yet it carried a weight heavier than any handcuffs he had ever felt. 20 years of service, public humiliation, and an institutional blind spot had been acknowledged, if only partially. Justice, it seemed, had arrived in increments, a slow drip rather than a torrent. The settlement, $340,000, was announced through legal channels, a figure that signaled recognition of wrongdoing but could never erase the trauma of that morning. Hayes' attorney explained the breakdown: compensatory damages for reputational harm, emotional distress, and punitive considerations designed to signal the department that procedural negligence would have financial consequences. Yet Hayes felt only a quiet dissonance. Money could settle accounts, but it could not settle trust. Trust in law enforcement, in the institutions meant to protect, in the systems that had failed him so palpably. Community response was immediate. Local advocacy groups organized forums on police accountability, invited city officials, officers, and residents to engage in dialogue. Citizens demanded systemic reform, bias awareness, retraining, transparent oversight, clear protocols for civilian interactions, and stricter adherence to evidentiary verification. Hayes attended one forum, sitting quietly at the back, observing the charged exchanges, the impassioned pleas for change. His presence, a living testament to failure and resilience, spoke louder than any speech. Within the department, the fallout was complex. Mercer's dismissal prompted reviews of internal policies, a top-to-bottom evaluation of supervisory oversight, and mandatory bias refresher courses for officers. Internal Affairs documented procedural deficiencies, highlighting the gaps between written protocol and field execution. For some officers, the revelations were uncomfortable truths. For others, they were a cautionary tale of accountability finally imposed. Hayes' case became a touchstone, cited in training sessions as an example of what happened when assumptions override evidence, when implicit bias dictates action over fact. Yet, even as reforms were drafted, there remained a human dimension. Hayes' reputation, though restored in official terms, had endured an invisible erosion. Invitations to speak at local units and veterans organizations arrived slowly. Former colleagues reached out in cautious admiration. Conversations, once private, now carried the weight of public attention. Each interaction, a reminder that resilience was both a personal achievement and a communal lesson. Cinematic reflection dominated the narrative. Flashbacks to the arrest slowed down in the mind's eye, each moment dissected. Mercer's hand brushing the holster, Hayes' calm composure, the glint of the receipt in the harsh store lighting. These memories, vivid and precise, reinforced the moral lesson embedded in every procedure. Failure, authority carries responsibility, and negligence carries consequences. Hayes' endurance had forced the institution to confront itself, but the reckoning was not instantaneous, not absolute. It unfolded in reports, meetings, and policy amendments, a mosaic of accountability slowly coming into focus. Even Mercer's firing carried layers of psychological weight. The officer, once empowered by rank and privilege, now faced public scrutiny, unemployment, and the quiet isolation that comes from moral and professional failure. The cameras that had captured Hayes' arrest now lingered on Mercer's public departure, the irony of exposure striking like a mirrored slab. In that moment, the balance shifted, not just legally, but morally, institutionally, and emotionally. And somewhere in the stillness of Hayes' reflection, a realization emerged: the system could correct itself, but only when persistence, documentation, and public awareness converged. The arrest, initially an act of blind authority, had become a catalyst for structure insight. The consequences were tangible, measured, procedural, yet their resonance would echo far beyond the courtroom and the precinct, touching policy, practice, and conscience alike. Winter had loosened its grip on Kansas City, and the street outside seemed quieter, Yet Hayes knew the world had not returned to normal. The arrest was behind him, technically resolved, but the experience lingered. In the subtle rhythms of his day, the way he watched officers approach civilians, the way he noticed procedural slip others might miss, the weight of vigilance that no settlement could erase. Justice had been served in dollars and disciplinary action, but the deeper work, cultural change, systemic accountability, was only beginning. Community forums continued to shape discourse. Hayes attended a few, not as a speaker but as a silent observer, letting the stories of others filter into his awareness. Parents, small business owners, and veterans shared encounters similar to his own, moments when authority collided with prejudice, leaving ordinary citizens exposed to the whims of discretion. Their voices, raw and unpolished, added layers to the understanding that institutional silence was not an anomaly. It was a pattern deeply ingrained, and only visible when challenged by evidence and courage. Within the Kansas City Police Department, reforms were gradually codified. Mandatory bias awareness courses were revised to incorporate real-world case studies, including Hayes' arrest. Supervisory protocols were adjusted to require verification of evidence before escalation. Internal Affairs was tasked with auditing interactions that carried the potential for bias. Policies that had existed on paper were now paired with consequences for non-compliance, signaling a shift from performative procedure to enforced accountability. Hayes' case was cited repeatedly, not as a triumph, but as a warning, a template for vigilance and reflection. Hayes himself began mentoring younger officers and veterans, drawing upon the paradox of his experience that authority is both protective and fragile, and that oversight is a form of defense as crucial as training. His reflections were quiet but potent. The lesson was not simply that one man could be wrong, but that systems enable wrongdoing if left unchecked. The moral of the arrest, crystallized over months of litigation, community dialogue, and policy review, was painfully simple. Institutions only evolve when individual courage meets procedural evidence. Public awareness had ripple effects beyond city boundaries. Local media continued coverage of police accountability, prompting other departments to reevaluate protocols. Social media forums documented procedural missteps elsewhere, referencing Hayes' case as a catalyst for change. The arrest, once a singular event, had grown into a narrative that connected personal experience with systemic reform. Hayes understood now that his ordeal had become part of a larger story, one where citizens, policymakers, and law enforcement officials shared responsibility for ethical governance. In quieter moments, Hayes reflected on Mercer, the officer whose decisions had set this chain of events in motion. The man had been fired, scrutinized publicly, and forced to reckon with his professional failings. Hayes did not feel triumph. He felt the muted weight of moral clarity. Authority unchecked can devastate lives, and consequences, though necessary, arrive late and never fully erase harm. The lesson was ethical, procedural, and profoundly human. Justice demands both accountability and reflection, and society cannot tolerate complacency in either. As evening fell, Hayes walked past the precinct where his arrest had occurred, the building now ordinary in appearance but forever etched in memory. The city around him carried on, commuters, shopkeepers, children on sidewalks unaware of the complex web of bias, procedure, and courage that had unfolded within its borders. The systemic changes were subtle, procedural, and ongoing, but Hayes knew the trajectory has shifted. Policies would endure, awareness would persist, and the conversation around bias in law enforcement had been irrevocably altered. In the end, Hayes understood the cost and the weight of vigilance. Justice, measured in procedural reforms, financial restitution, and cultural shifts, had been achieved, but its real impact lay in the quiet, ongoing work of reflection and reform. The arrest had ended, but the story of systemic change continued, carried forward by the vigilance of those unwilling to accept silence, by the courage of those who demanded accountability, and by the enduring truth that authority must always answer to justice. Hayes paused at the corner where the store once stood. The faint echo of that morning, the fluorescent glare, the metallic click of handcuffs still lingered in his memory. But it no longer carried the weight of helplessness. He had endured, documented, and forced accountability, and yet He understood something essential. The system could only change if individuals remained vigilant, if witnesses, citizens, and officers alike refused to accept inertia as normal. The city around him moved with ordinary rhythm, traffic lights cycling, a child's laughter bouncing off brick facades, a clerk restocking shelves, but beneath the mundane, subtle shifts were underway. Supervisors now questioned their officers more rigorously. Internal affairs audits had become routine rather than reactive. Training modules referenced real cases, including Hayes, to teach recognition of bias before it could escalate. Small, incremental changes, yet they represented a moral and procedural pivot. Hayes allowed himself a brief inward smile. Not triumph, not vindication, but clarity. The arrest had been an injustice, yes, but it had sparked reflection and reform that would outlive the headlines. Justice was never absolute, he knew, but accountability, when paired with persistent courage, could bend institutions toward integrity. As he walked away from the precinct, the evening sun glinting off city streets, Hayes felt the resonance of his journey. A private pain transformed into public vigilance. A moment of silence amplified into lasting systemic awareness. The moral was simple but profound. Authority must always answer to truth, and those who wield it bear the responsibility to see, hear, and act justly. The story of one master sergeant had become more than a singular wrong. It had become a blueprint for accountability, reflection, and enduring change. In the quiet aftermath, Hayes carried both the memory of what had been lost and the weight of what had been set in motion. The city, the department, the public, none would forget entirely. And perhaps in that persistence, justice had found its most lasting form.